So this your mine, huh?
Yes, this is my mine. My dad showed it to me about 5 years ago.
Well, that's
Here
a
you
beanie.
go, Fred. I'll let you do the honors.
There's a hat in it.
That
Oh,
actually looks pretty good.
yeah, it does.
Wow.
You guys ready to weigh this up?
Yep, I am.
When Freddy Dodge and Juan Ibarra stepped onto that claim, it wasn't a gold mine. It was a graveyard for money. The ground was producing a miserable 0.2 ounces per run. Diesel costs were crushing them, the crew was losing hope, and $120,000 had already vanished into the mud. Most miners would have walked away, but Freddy and Juan don't walk away. 6 weeks later, the very same dirt that nearly destroyed the operation exploded with gold, 13.12 ounces in just 4 hours. One single morning worth $25,000. The kind of turnaround miners dream about, but rarely see. What did they change? What did they see that everyone else missed? Because this wasn't luck. It was precision. It was experience. And what they uncovered didn't just revive a failing claim. It completely reshaped one family's future. And what happened after that gold hit the scales? It didn't feel real. Subscribe now for more unbelievable gold rush turnarounds and real mining success stories you won't hear anywhere else. The morning they arrived, a thick fog blanketed the valley, heavy and silent. The air carried the scent of damp soil mixed with diesel. The same smell Anthony Marsh had breathed in every day for the past 3 years. His wash plant stood in the clearing like a forgotten monument, rust creeping along the edges, mud swallowing the tracks. Machinery that was meant to change his life had only emptied his savings and strained his family to the breaking point. The camp itself told the story, without a word. A weather-beaten canvas tent was Anthony's home for 7 months out of the year. A small propane heater he used sparingly because fuel costs had climbed too high. No power, no plumbing. If he wanted a shower, it meant a 40-minute drive into town. Tucked into the flap of that tent, curling from moisture and time, was a photograph. His wife, Rachel. Their 2 sons, Marcus and Tyler, smiling, from a season of life when they still believed this dream would work. Before the late nights, before the missed promises, before gold mining took over everything. Rachel hadn't visited in months. The last time she came out, she found Anthony at 2 a.m., covered in grease, hunched over a dead engine with only a flashlight cutting through the dark. She watched him quietly before asking the question that still echoed in his mind every night. When is it enough? When do you walk away? He never had an answer. He still doesn't. Marcus, the oldest, is 13 now. He was just 10 when Anthony bought this claim, using money meant for college, for stability, for the future they had mapped out together. 3 birthdays missed, 3 Christmases cut short, 3 years of watching his mom pretend everything was okay. Tyler, now 9, stopped asking when his dad was coming home. He'd learned not to trust the reply. When Freddy asked how much gold Anthony had pulled last season, Anthony couldn't look up. About 20 ounces. Roughly $1,200 for an entire year of grinding labor. After investing $120,000 in equipment. After everything his family had given up. His target this season? 40 ounces. Just to break even, just to show Rachel it hadn't all been for nothing. Freddy and Juan exchanged a glance. 40 ounces meant producing 50 times more than Anthony had managed the year before. It meant overturning 3 straight years of failure. It meant pulling off something close to a miracle. So they decided to start simple, a 4-hour test run. The plant roared to life with hesitation, metal grinding against metal. For 4 long hours, Anthony shoveled material through his aging setup, the rhythm mechanical, his thoughts anything but. Rachel's words replayed in his head on a loop. When cleanup time came, everyone gathered around the scale. By then, the sun had burned through the fog. The valley was clear, but Anthony felt ice cold, because that number, that one single number, would decide whether there was still hope left or whether this dream was finally over. Juan tipped the concentrate into his pan and began to swirl. Across the steel surface, a faint streak of yellow appeared, so thin it almost disappeared against the metal. It wasn't a flash. It wasn't a pile. It was a trace. 0.2 ounces. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to touch. No one shifted. No one spoke. The only sounds were the engine ticking as it cooled and the distant murmur of the creek winding through the valley. Anthony's arms fell limp at his sides. His expression didn't twist with anger. It didn't collapse into tears. It emptied. It was the face of someone who had simply run out of belief. That number didn't even pay the bills. That night, long after Anthony disappeared into his tent, Juan noticed Freddy standing alone at the edge of camp. Above them, the sky burned with stars, brighter than anywhere near a city. Beyond the clearing stretched a valley of untouched forest, dark and ancient, a place that looked like time had forgotten it. They had helped struggling miners before. But this, Anthony's target, wasn't just ambitious, it bordered on impossible. Still, Freddy couldn't stop staring at that undisturbed timber. What if the machinery wasn't the only issue? What if no one had ever tested the right ground? The man sleeping in that tent had already sacrificed nearly everything. The least they could do was find out if there was still something worth fighting for. The bet. The next morning, Freddy laid it out. They would tear down the entire wash plant and rebuild it from scratch. New sluice boxes, a redesigned feed system, everything re-engineered. And if they couldn't at least double his gold recovery, he wouldn't pay for the materials. Double or nothing. Two men staking their reputation on a miner who could barely scrape together a fraction of an ounce. It sounded unbelievable, almost suspicious. Anthony kept waiting for the catch. Why would strangers risk that much for someone they had just met? He'd grown used to people walking away, suppliers refusing credit, old friends going quiet, locals whispering about the guy throwing his life away in the mountains. Even his own father had called it foolish, said he'd never build anything worthwhile in that valley. Freddy looked at the tent Anthony lived in 7 months of the year, at the weathered photo of Rachel and the boys, at the battered equipment that represented 3 long years of sacrifice. Anthony had already lost enough, and Freddy was convinced there was gold here that no one had ever uncovered. So they got to work. Juan began dismantling the plant with calm, surgical precision. Parts that had tormented Anthony for years came apart in hours. Rusted pipes, crooked sluice runs, a feed system that had never functioned properly. The flaws were obvious once exposed. 4 sharp 90-degree bends, 10 feet of unnecessary piping, every turn choking water pressure, and weak pressure meant clay stayed intact. Clay is a thief in gold mining. It clings to fine gold and carries it straight out of the sluice, dumping it into the tailings. Months of work. Washed away. Anthony stood nearby, watching 3 years of his life come apart bolt by bolt. Each removed piece felt like proof of failure. While Juan rebuilt, Freddy headed into the forest with nothing but a gold pan and instinct. The trees swallowed him whole, towering pines that hadn't been logged in a century. Moss draped from branches. Ferns blanketed the ground. The air carried the scent of pine and something else. Possibility. If this valley had been worked before, it hadn't been worked thoroughly. Freddy traced the curve of an ancient stream bed. Smooth, rounded stones marking the path of a river long gone. Exactly the kind of place where gold settles and waits. He crouched and scooped a pan of dirt, carrying it to the creek. Swirl, wash. Swirl. Black sand gathered at the bottom, then color. Bright, unmistakable flakes catching the afternoon sun. There was more gold in that single pan than Anthony had seen in months. It wasn't riches, but it was proof. Proof that hope wasn't dead. Back at camp, Sparks flew as Juan welded new steel bars into the sluice frame. The layout looked strange. Uneven heights, unconventional spacing, sharp angles that didn't seem symmetrical. To most eyes, it looked random. It wasn't. They were copying nature. Gold sticks in bedrock because of cracks, crevices, rough edges, places where water slows just enough for heavy material to drop out. If they could mimic that in steel, they wouldn't just be running dirt. They'd finally be catching what had been slipping away all along. Some gold won't settle in one setup, but shift the angles, change the flow, give it another texture to cling to, and suddenly it stays. The more variety in the sluice, the better the odds of trapping every last flake. But late that night, long after the tools were down and Anthony had retreated to his tent, Juan spotted Freddy sitting alone by the fading fire. Yes, Freddy had found gold in that untouched stretch of valley. Yes, the old-timers had overlooked an ancient channel. So why the concern etched across his face? Because discovering gold is one thing, actually capturing it is another. If they were wrong about this rebuild, they wouldn't just lose money on materials. They'd hand Anthony something far more dangerous. Hope. Hope that he could fix his marriage. Hope that he could be present for his sons again. And if it failed, they'd leave. And he'd be right back where he started. Broke. Alone. Defeated. That would be worse than never trying. They couldn't afford to be wrong. The close call, 3 days into the rebuild, everything nearly fell apart. They were guiding a 2,000-pound hopper into place when a chain suddenly snapped. The crack echoed like a rifle shot. The hopper swung violently, steel turning into a pendulum of chaos. Kelly, their helper, was standing directly in its path. Juan didn't think. He reacted. He lunged forward, grabbed Kelly by the jacket, and yanked him back just as the hopper slammed into the support frame. Metal shrieked, sparks flew. Then silence. Kelly's hands trembled so badly he couldn't grip his wrench. That impact could have killed him. The frame was bent. A bracket had torn clean off. Half a day's progress wiped out in 2 seconds, and they didn't have time to waste. Double or nothing. They started over, inspected every chain, every shackle, every bolt. No shortcuts, no guesswork. Either do it right or don't do it at all. The next few days blurred together in a haze of welding arcs and grinding steel. Cut, fit, test, repeat. Each night, Anthony called Rachel. Each night, she asked the same question. "When are you coming home?" "Soon. It's almost done." 3 years of almost done. The first test, on day 5, they stepped back. The plant looked familiar. Same skeleton, but inside, everything had changed. Fresh steel gleamed against weathered iron. New heart. Old body. Tomorrow would decide everything. That night, Anthony made one more call. Rachel told him if it worked, he needed to bring the boys up this summer, let them see what he'd been fighting for, and if it didn't, then he'd come home, and they'd rebuild whatever was left. Dawn broke gray and cold. Mist drifted off the creek like spirits lifting away. Anthony hadn't slept. He'd stared at that photograph all night, memorizing the faces he might have to face with failure. 3 years came down to this. They fired up the engine. It roared, stronger, smoother than Anthony had ever heard it. Water blasted through the redesigned spray bars with real pressure. Material fed cleanly into the system instead of choking it. For the first time in years, the plant ran the way it was supposed to. The difference was immediate. Cleaner wash. Rocks tumbling properly. Fines flowing exactly where they should. No clogs, no chaos. Anthony could hardly believe it. Same rusted frame, completely different machine. 20 minutes in, it was flawless. Then trouble hit. Water began spilling from Juan's custom 3-way splitter. Gold-bearing slurry poured over the edge, vanishing into tailings. They were losing gold. Juan sprinted over, grabbed scrap plywood, and in seconds fashioned a rough cap, forcing the flow back into place. It held. They kept running. 2 hours later, they'd processed more material than Anthony used to handle in a month. The sluices were loading up with concentrate that actually looked rich. Double or nothing. At 4 hours, Freddy shut it down. In the clean-up pan, gold shimmered through the black sand, more than Anthony had seen in years. But this was still old ground. The real test would come when they paired this rebuilt plant with the untouched channel Freddy had discovered. Tomorrow, they'd move. Tomorrow, they'd know. 6 weeks later, Anthony carved a road into what they started calling Freddy's Valley. Dense forest that hadn't been disturbed in a century fell slowly under the excavator's push. It took days to break through. Then he peeled back 2 feet of useless overburden. Below it lay pay dirt untouched since the gold rush, ground the old-timers had somehow missed. Early runs looked promising. 1/2 ounce, 3/4, more gold in a week than he'd seen in months before. But promising isn't proof. Promise doesn't erase $120,000 in debt. Promise doesn't fix a family. Anthony needed something undeniable. And then it happened. Freddy and Juan were helping another struggling miner a few hundred meters away when Anthony's video call came through. His face filled the screen. He was smiling. Really smiling. For the first time since they'd met him, his eyes were red, but not from exhaustion. Behind him, a cleanup tray gleamed. He tilted the camera. Gold, not flecks, not dust. Chunks, thick pieces. Nuggets heavy enough to cast shadows. A blanket of yellow piled high, spilling toward the edges. They had just finished a 4-hour run. 13.12 ounces. The words felt unreal. 13.12 ounces. About $25,000 in a single morning. More than he'd produced in his first 2 years combined. And it wasn't a fluke. They'd already logged a 20-ounce day. Multiple 7-ounce days. The system was performing exactly as designed. The new sluices were trapping fine gold that would have washed away before. The rebuilt feed system was chewing through material at a pace Anthony never thought possible. And the ground? It had been there all along. Freddy later shook his head. The old-timers had worked the valley hydraulically with water cannons, blasting away hillsides. Plenty of gold likely slipped through their fingers. They just hadn't reached the right spot. It was less than 100 yards from where Anthony had struggled for 3 years. He'd walked past it countless times. Rachel was bringing the boys up next week. Marcus had been asking every single day when he could learn to pan. This time, when his father said, soon, he meant it. Marcus wanted to see it for himself. He wanted to understand why his dad had fought so hard for this patch of ground. What made the mud, the noise, the sleepless nights worth it? Then something unexpected happened. Anthony's father called. For 2 years, there had been silence, and before that, only criticism, warnings that this whole thing was a mistake, that his son was wasting his life chasing dirt in a valley no one cared about. But this time was different. This time, he didn't lecture. He said he was proud. Freddy and Juan hadn't just rebuilt a wash plant. They'd helped rebuild something far more fragile. Anthony did the hard part. 3 years of grinding it out. 3 years of doubt. 3 years of people telling him to quit. He never walked away. But Freddy and Juan gave him an opportunity. A real shot. And that changed everything. Double or nothing. They'd promised they could double his gold recovery. They didn't double it. They multiplied it by 20. And the Marsh family wasn't the only one. In Montana, the Komoric family saw their gold totals double. Enough to rescue not just their mine, but their struggling aviation business. Years of pressure lifted in a single season. A father and son who hadn't spoken properly in 2 decades found themselves standing side by side at a sluice box, working toward the same goal. Gold became more than money. It became common ground. Out in the Mojave Desert, The Gretzner crew boosted production by 700%. Material the old-timers had tossed aside as waste turned out to hold staggering value. 40,000 tons of overlooked pay dirt sitting in plain sight, waiting for someone to see what others had missed. In Oregon, a miner named Chad finally packed up the tent he'd lived in for 7 months out of every year. His best friend had taken a chance and invested when no one else would. When they watched the gold stack up on the scale, he whispered, "This is it. This is what we've been fighting for." Later, standing near the old furnace at the historic Sumter Dredge ruins, Freddy and Juan talked about why they keep doing this. The road costs them a lot. They miss birthdays, holidays, dinners at their own kitchen tables. They sleep in trucks and budget motels instead of their own beds. But the reward? It's watching someone's life turn around. It's the look on a miner's face when the gold hits the scale. It's seeing families heal. It's watching a dream that was fading suddenly catch fire again. That's something you can't measure in ounces. They don't just repair broken equipment. They help repair futures. Today, Anthony Marsh's mine produces more gold in a single week than it once did in an entire year. Last summer, Marcus stood beside his father, learning how to pan, hands in the water, eyes searching for that flash of yellow. Rachel doesn't ask, "When is enough enough?" anymore. She already knows. And Anthony finally gets to say the words he waited 3 long years to earn. He's a gold miner, and he made it. The results weren't just good. They weren't just impressive. They were life-changing.